The Wars of the Roses were a triumph and a tragedy in history for many reasons. However, to understand these reasons, one must first know the events of the Civil War in England, which lasted from 1455 until 1485.
Henry VI, the King of England before the commencement of the Wars of the Roses and a bit during the beginning of this period, became king as a 9-month-old infant when his father died of dysentery. He was a simple-minded man who lacked a spine. He was extremely kind-hearted, which is not always a very good trait for a king to possess. Thankfully, however, his wife, Margaret of Anjou, had a stiff enough vertebrae for both of them, maybe too much. Because of her, England's relations with France deteriorated immensely, which is weird considering she was French, and also the Wars of the Roses could not be avoided. If just Henry VI had been in charge, he probably would have fixed the relations with the rebellious Yorks.
The Yorks believed that Richard, Duke of York, should be king, as he was the only man with unbroken male descent from King Edward III, besides the king himself. He also was, unlike the king who prayed for peace, a strong military commander and the richest landowner in all of England.
Then, in 1453, Henry decided to go crazy, which is always a wonderful idea for a king. Because of the king's unstable mental state, there had to be a Lord Protector of the realm put in place to rule while King Henry VI had fun in Crazy Town. Richard, the Duke of York, took this position until Henry recovered in 1455 and decided it was time to be king again. During his 15th month bout of insanity, Margaret gave birth to a son, giving the king the heir he lacked.
However, Richard Neville, aka the Earl of Warwick, and others decided they didn't want a ruler who had just returned from a spin in the loony bin. Apparently, they thought this was a bad idea. So, on May 22nd, 1455, the first battle of the 30-year-long Wars of the Roses commenced at St. Albans.
The first Battle of St. Albans was the Yorkist victory against the royal ruling Lancasters, which was awkward because that meant the king lost the battle on his own turf. However, this battle turned out to be a triumph for the entire country of England, as 4 years of truce, however precarious this truce proved to be, followed, even though the Lancasters may have seen it as a tragedy.
But alas, peace could not continue. The Wars of the Roses resumed in 1459, and on September 23rd, the second battle of the war took place at Blore Heath. The Yorks were able to win a second time.
During the third battle, Richard, the Duke of York, was killed at the Battle of Wakefield. His head was placed on a spike and topped with a paper crown by the Lancasters to show off their victory of killing the rebellious Duke. However, the Duke of York had a son, Edward, who was not willing to let his father die in vain. Here is an example of one of the letters sent to Richard, the Duke of York, from his son when Edward had been the Earl of March. In this letter, Edward praises his father and shows his loyalty and appreciation for him. In addition, the letter describes the normal father-son relationship between the two, as evidenced by the thanking for the gifts received, and then immediately asking for more. It reads,
Right high and right mighty Prince, our full redoubted and right noble Lord and Father, as lowly with all our hearts as we, your true and natural sons, can or may, we recommend us unto your noble grace, humbly beseeching your nobly and worthy fatherhood daily, to give us your heartly blessing, through which we trust much the rather to increase and grow to virtue and to speed the better in all matters and things that we shall use, occupy, and exercise. Right high and right mighty Prince, our full redoubted Lord and Father, we thank our blessed Lord not only of your honorable conduit and good speed in all your matters and business, and of your gracious prevail against and malice of your evil willers, but also of the knowledge that pleased your nobility to let us no late have of the same by relation of Sir Warrior Daroon Knight, and John Mill Wadier Squire, and John at Noakes Yeman of your honorable chamber. Also, we thank your nobleness and good fatherhood of our green gown now late sent unto us to our great comfort, beseeching your good lordship to remember our poteau, and that we might have some fine bonnets sent unto us by the next secure messenger, for necessity so requires. Over this, right noble lord and father, please hit your highness to write that we have charged your servant, William Smith, bearer of these, for to declare your nobility certain things on our behalf, namely concerning and touching the odious rule and demoning of Richard Croft and of his brother. Wherefore we beseech your gracious lordship and full noble fatherhood to hear him in exposition of the same, and to his relation to your full faith and credence. Right high and right noble lord and father, we beseech Almighty may you live as good life and long, with as much continual perfect prosperity as your princely heart can best desire. Written at your castle of Ludlow on Saturday in the Easter week, your humble sons, the Earl of March, the Earl of Rutland.
Circling back to the Wars of the Roses, the Lancasters then won the battle at Ludford Bridge. The poor little Yorkist spirits were crushed, and they ran away to France with their kind of leader Warwick to regroup and return to England a few months later. They came back in June of 1460, after putting aside their hurt feelings. Therapy sessions can take a few months, you know. On July 10, 1460, the Yorks defeated the Lancasters at Northampton, a triumph for the York forces.
In a rare bout of less than violent negotiations, the Yorks finally decided that they would just wait till old Henry VI kicked the bucket and come into power then. However, this meant that Prince Edward, Henry's son, was disinherited. This made Margaret of Anjou a wee bit mad, which was not good. So, well, the Wars of the Roses could have ended there. Margaret wouldn't have it. The Lancasters defeated Warwick, and thus the Yorks, at the Second Battle of St. Albans on February 17, 1461, to make up for the terrible loss of the First Battle of St. Albans, which was honestly just embarrassing.
Edward, the eldest son and heir of York, defeated the Lancasters at Mortimer's Cross and headed to London, reaching Margaret of Anjou's forces on February 26th, and, with what was left of Warwick, aka the Kingmaker's, forces, Edward managed to push Margaret to Towton.
During this time, Edward decided it would be nice to be king, and thus declared himself King Edward IV at Westminster on March 4th.
Then Margaret's forces marched to what would become the Battle of Towton, considered the bloodiest battle of the war. She was defeated there on March 29, 1461, in a snowstorm on Palm Sunday, thus a triumph for the York forces and a tragedy for the Lancasters. King Henry VI, Margaret of Anjou, and their son, Edward, fled to Scotland to hide. This proved to be the end of Phase 1 of the Wars of the Roses, but not the end of the war itself.
During Phase 2, King Edward IV became the actual king, crowned on Midsummer's Day. However, there was some unrest within the Yorkist ranks. The Kingmaker, Richard, Earl of Warwick, wished to play puppet with King Edward IV and advance his own family's standings. However, Edward proved to be able to make his own decisions once on the throne, something the Earl of Warwick did not appreciate.
Edward made what seemed to Warwick to be a foible in his foreign policy. He was supposed to marry Isabella of Spain, but instead he had apparently been married to Elizabeth Woodville, a Lancastrian baron's widow, for 5 months. This put him at odds with the Kingmaker, who had not realized Edward was married.
Warwick, anticipating moving against the king, swayed Edward's brother Clarence to his side. When the king was distracted with a rebellion in the north, Warwick declared his hope that the rebels and the king might reconcile. But before he could meet the king with his troops, Edward had been soundly defeated by the rebels. After Warwick met up with the king, he effectively became Warwick's prisoner. Edward was told that his future reign would be according to Warwick's advice, but the king did not forget this insult.
Under the pretense of defeating another rebellion, the king called his army and obtained a confession from a rebel accusing both Warwick and his brother Clarence of treason. To avoid being caught, they fled to France, which also happened to be the refuge of Margaret of Anjou. The King of France, Louis XI, who was none too fond of Edward, proposed that Warwick and Margaret join forces to overthrow him. They agreed, proposing that Margaret's son Edward should marry Warwick's daughter Anne. However, this meant that the king's traitorous brother Clarence had less of a chance at the throne, which was his reason for deserting, so Clarence planned to rejoin his brother eventually.
When they had gathered their strength, the Lancastrians struck. Yes, they're actually still around. King Edward was forced to flee to Burgundy after being sorely outmaneuvered. King Henry VI was released from his prison and made king again, though it was truly the kingmaker who was running the show.
In March 1471, King Edward returned to England and began a march to London. Warwick became increasingly panicked and stationed himself at Coventry, with forces moving behind Edward as well. However, Edward had a hidden weapon the kingmaker was unaware of, his brother Clarence, who soon joined him. The Battle of Barnet commenced and was won by Edward. Warwick died in this battle.
Once more, the conflict was only between the Yorks and Lancasters. The Lancastrians made for Wales their stronghold, and the Yorkist men met them at Tewkesbury. Margaret's son was slain in this battle, and she herself was captured. Now that his heir was dead, there was no reason to keep Henry VI alive, and he was executed. King Edward IV and his army entered London victorious. The triumph of their cause was complete.
King Edward ruled for years, and the Yorks might have been secure in their victory if he had not died suddenly of illness in April 1483, leaving his brother Richard to become protector, as his eldest son was only 12. During this time, however, the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, and her family were ever hated, and her marriage to King Edward IV declared illegitimate, disinheriting her sons. In light of these events, Richard was the next in line and became King Richard III.
King Richard III was also very unpopular among the people due to the general feeling that he was a usurper. He also murdered people left and right, adding to the distaste from the population, as he became worried about maintaining his position, and also about the two sons of his brother who still lived. Though there is some controversy, evidently he had them secretly murdered. Nonetheless, the two boys in the tower mysteriously disappeared, or, more accurately, they were just never seen again.
Meanwhile, King Richard's right-hand man, the Duke of Gloucester, had betrayed him. He arranged to marry Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant to the throne, to Elizabeth, daughter of King Edward. After Richard's son died, Henry Tudor, the Earl of Richmond, was the obvious rival in succession. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor and King Richard crossed swords, and Tudor emerged victorious. King Richard died in the battle, and after Henry Tudor later married Princess Elizabeth, the houses of York and Lancaster were joined, and the kingdom henceforth marched on united, the greatest triumph of all after a long, bloody civil war.
In all, many small triumphs and large tragedies are apparent in this 30-year war. Each battle won a triumph for one side and a tragedy for the opposing. In the end, the final triumph belongs to Henry Tudor, who entered at the very end of the war and managed to win it all anyways. The Wars of the Roses ended the Plantagenet dynasty, leading to a long and prosperous Tudor dynasty of England. However, the Wars of the Roses were a tragedy for all in England, resulting in the deaths of many Englishmen from all sides of the war.
Elizabeth Woodville had 5 brothers, 7 sisters, and 2 sons from a previous marriage. Edward IV rose them all to a high rank, or otherwise married them to noble families. For instance, he married one of Elizabeth's brothers to the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk when he was 20, and his betrothed was 80.
King Edward IV's brother Clarence, whose name was actually George, he was just the Duke of Clarence, was subject to a feeble mental state. His wife, Isabel, daughter of the kingmaker Warwick, died of what was most likely a fever after giving birth to a son who died soon after. However, he was convinced that his wife's handmaid had poisoned her and bullied a jury into convicting said maid of murder by poison, and she was hung for her supposed crime.
Clarence, or George, was murdered for being a traitor. However, he was able to choose his method of execution. So, he chose to be drowned in his favorite wine, Malmsey wine. His corpse was then also transported to his grave in the vat of this wine.
Richard III was married to Kingmaker Warwick's other daughter, Anne Neville, meaning that Richard III and his brother, Clarence, married sisters.
During the time this Civil War was taking place, it was not known as the War of the Roses. Rather, this was a name devised based off of Shakespeare's play documenting the war, where the Yorks were represented by a white rose and the Lancasters a red.
After Edward IV became king and the Lancasters were largely defeated, one fortress alone still resisted. When the castle of Harlech surrendered in 1468, all but 2 of the 50 men in the garrison were spared. One of those who were spared was a 12-year-old boy named Henry Tudor, who later became King Henry VII. He was lucky this happened during King Edward's merciful phase. If he had been in his mean phase, England would have been in trouble.
On June 13, 1483, when Richard was the protector of the realm, he went to the council chamber and said, "What punishment do they deserve who conspire against the life of one so nearly related to the king as myself, and entrusted with the government of the realm?" The councilman replied that they deserved the punishment of traitors. "That sorceress my brother's wife and others with her. See how they have wasted my body with sorcery and witchcraft." He was then reputed to have held out his arm, which was said to be shrunk and withered as popularized by Shakespeare's plays.
There comes a day when we all find out for ourselves. The ones we have the words to say